Bye.
Okay, fantastic. I think we've got a few people joining us now. We'll just hang on probably 1 more minute and let some more join our webinar today. Yeah, great. People are coming in thick and fast now. Okay, I think we'll get started. So I'll begin by saying thank you to everyone for joining us today. This is actually our second webinar in a series of webinars that we're doing, really focusing on accessibility, digital accessibility. And this time we're discussing the topic around getting your business on board. And I think it's a really hot topic at the moment as we fast approach June 28th, 2025. So I'm really, really pleased. I've got Stacy Scott, who's head of accessibility at Taylor & Francis, and Simon Mellins, who's a really experienced digital publishing and accessibility consultant, with me again today. They were also with me a few weeks ago on our image descriptions webinar. And we've actually got over 100 people registered today, which is really wonderful. And I think that, again, gives a great indication of how important this topic is. So I know you're probably all here because you understand the importance of accessibility, but is this the case for everyone in your organisation or the majority of people in your organisation? So in this session, we're going to give you lots of advice, lots of hints and lots of tips about really how to get that buy-in, who to involve in the process, how to make it a top priority in your business, and how to build consensus and make that consensus sticky. We're also going to look at job roles and how to set up a team. So I think you're going to find this really interesting. So Stacy has done this many, many times before and hugely successfully at Taylor & Francis. So she's going to give us some great insights into real life, if you like. And Simon's been working really closely with a number of publishers and well-known publishers, helping to steer them in the right direction. So I think you're all going to find this really, really useful and extremely helpful. So please ask lots of questions. We will leave the questions until the end so that we can sort of monitor and control the time much better. So yes, I hope you can all hear us okay. If there are any issues, just pop it into that Q&A box if anyone's having any problems. Simon, I'm going to turn to you first. Big, broad question. How does an organisation get buy-in on this?
Yeah, thank you, Deborah. And hello, everybody. This is the second time I've talked about this topic recently. Some of you will have seen the article that I did for Book Machine on this very topic. Why am I obsessed with this business case piece? This is really crucial when you're dealing with accessibility, because fundamentally, and I don't have slides today, but if I did, there'd be one, and it would say accessibility is expensive. Be prepared. So rather than trying to make it cost nothing, rather than trying to find a clever way through, embrace the fact that this will have some costs and build a robust business case to make sure that whoever is controlling the purse strings in your organization will let you have the resources that you need. Those could be human or economic resources, almost certainly both. So when we're talking about building a robust business case for accessibility, in the frame that this is not in fact optional, so we're building a business case to convince people to do what they need to do, there are 4 main pillars to build your business case on, like all of the most stable structures. So the first one is risk. This is a magic word when you're talking to, particularly to higher ups and C-suites. Risk is scary. So that's reputational risk as well as compliance risk, risk of fines. There's the ethical piece on just doing right by your audience, inclusivity, which includes accessibility, inclusivity in the broad, and then corporate responsibility is all part of that piece. The third pillar is potential sales advantages. And I always caution, do not boast or promise sales numbers or percentages, because you can't give them. And people will sense that you're waffling at that point. But in a general sense, you could talk about procurement restrictions for some organizational purchasers of content when they need accessible content and can't buy yours if it's not. You'll never know that they didn't buy your content for that reason. There's no stat for it. They're sort of ghost sales lost. Export markets, of course, markets you can't access at all because of accessibility bars that you're not meeting. And then people who have print disabilities but have not sought any treatment or registered and are self-treating and may just be buying products for themselves that suit their needs properly. If your products don't suit their needs, they won't buy what you got. Again, you will never know about that lost sale. So that's the third piece. And the fourth is future proofing. The work that you do for accessibility, which is not the topic in itself of this webinar, but the various things you do for accessibility all improve the depth and richness of the information in an ebook file. Fundamentally, what that means is that in the long run, it is easier to repurpose that title. Very often this involves reconversion, but even just improvements being made to old backlist. What you're doing is investing in your catalog and making it ready for future formats. It'll be more transformable and able to interface with anything in the future, including future formats or even AIs. There is a difference, a subtle one, but there are a few differences in how this would apply to a very large or very small organization. I work with all different sizes, and I have seen a few trends, but of course, all of these are generalizations. I would say in a smaller organization, if that's you, often this will mean the creation of a work and the production are closer together. This can be an advantage for some things like alt text or semantics, or kind of adding code semantics. But then there are also fewer people to spread the work through. So is the ask financial or is it time? There are also, in theory, lower budgets. That's what people often say, although actually in practice, I find big and small publishers are very conscious of the bottom line, and margins per book are watched very carefully. So that financial piece may or may not be valid. But if it is, it would be because of the third part of that, which is regulatory exemption. There is a micro enterprise exemption in the European Accessibility Act. The definition of what that is varies. There is an EU standard for that in a separate document. France followed that, which was a 2 million euro threshold for turnover. Germany set it higher at 10 million. Ireland lowered it down to 50,000 euro. So it's a slightly unpredictable target, but you may be able to claim a micro enterprise exemption. There are two other exemptions which are not exclusive to smaller publishers. Those would be disproportionate burden, which is a sort of cost benefit analysis for how impactful the improvement would be for a given work. And then fundamental alteration, which is something like a book that is primarily visual with only a few words, whether you're fundamentally transforming the nature of what something is. But both of those arguments are really highly subjective and may not hold up in a legal case or an ethical one. So moving on to larger organizations, sometimes there is more of a gap between the creation of a work, and I include editorial and authors in that, and production of a work. There may be a larger gap, there may be more complex workflows. Again, it really varies. Sometimes smaller publishers use freelancers, in which case there's plenty of distance. It really depends on the organizational makeup, but sometimes large organizations, the people actually making the book are a long way from the authoring, and that can make it quite difficult to do some of the accessibility work. You have to sort of know all of this when you're writing your business case and have some sense of how it will work. Budgets may seem higher for larger organizations, but as I've said, per book, it's often not the case. Margins are watched everywhere. And the other thing with a larger organization is you will be held to a higher regulatory bar. So that's a very useful thing in a business case. So if you're a large publisher, you can say, right, if anyone's going to get in trouble, it will be us. We're a big target, so we need to be above board. Both small and large publishers are likely to use vendors in order to meet their accessibility obligations. And because of that, it's important to mention this in a business case. You're going to need funding to do this. And of course, there'll be other kinds of corporate governance involved with taking on a third party. So this is all stuff to prepare for in advance. I group these into three types of vendors you might use, but obviously there could be more. But there are, of course, the freelancers that particularly smaller publishers will often already contract out for typesetting and other work. very important if you are going to continue with that model, that you ensure any freelancer you're using is aware of accessibility and is aware of everything that needs to be done. And that's not just them saying, yes, I get it, I get accessibility. It needs a more in-depth conversation, because they could introduce huge liability there if they're not doing the work properly and lower product quality. The other type of vendor to think about is full service vendors. You get companies who will offer every part of the publishing process. Deborah smiles. You get companies that will do everything from typesetting to accessibility work to distribution and what have you. The other type of vendor is specialized vendors who will pick out one part of the process and really zoom in on that. So there are specialists in accessible code remediation, in doing all the tricky code bits. There are, of course, alt text specialists, some of them using human teams and some of them using AI. If they are using AI, make sure that they have subject matter experts on hand, particularly if you're in any kind of technical publishing category. There are specialized vendors for accessibility metadata, because of course, if you've been to our other webinar, you'll know that's one of your obligations, that you have to produce this discoverability, accessibility metadata. And there are vendors to help with accessibility statements, which is another crucial thing that websites will need to have and books will need to refer to.
Wow. I think that, you've just really summed that up fantastically, Simon. And I think really indicated there are so many people, there are so many things to consider when building your business case. So really, who should you involve in the organization to build and create your business case? Who should you identify and target?
Yeah, this is the power move here. If you just perhaps you're in a production role or something like that, you're not going to be able to make a compelling enough case just on your own, or at least you're not going to have the kind of fuel behind it to get it where it needs to be. Make use of the resources in the company that you work in. So if your company has in-house lawyers, they are the most useful people you can have. Sometimes they're not aware of all this fully. Surprisingly enough, publishing lawyers have a lot of things to be on top of. Sometimes they're not fully on with EAA or related legislation. So make sure they're on board. Even if you don't have in-house lawyers, perhaps you have sort of frequent counsel, maybe somebody on retainer. Find out what the legal situation is. They will be your advocates in this. Once you've explained the risk to them, or maybe they already understand it, but once you've linked up with them, they become a driving force behind everything you do. They have door opening strengths when it comes to getting into C-suite. They are the people who will help you to make that case. And if something needs to be spent for compliance reasons, they are going to be the people who will enable that. Compliance is a really, really important word here. This is a magic word in business. It has real world risk in fines and reputational damage. This is beyond just corporate responsibility. To make sure to talk about compliance. The other useful group of people is the sales team. Of course, we talked earlier about this. There are lost sales you'll never hear about. But once you explain that to sales teams, they'll often be very interested. Of course, barriers to market entry are always something on the minds of salespeople when they want to make the best use of their content and move it around. Reduced reusability and repurposing of content. Think about co-editions. Reputational damage is also something of interest to sales because that can have a real world impact. So get them on board. No one is going to be saying we'll get X% more sales or X thousand million sales. It's very important to be careful with being overly specific, but generally speaking, accessibility is good business. If your organization has a corporate responsibility team, dedicated team there, or anything similar, I know some of them have got funky names now, but bring them in. They are going to be a big part of this. When it comes down to the responsibility and the ethics part, make it clear to them that part of being inclusive is being accessible, that these are not separate things. This is not a technical or sidelined matter. This is a vital part of what it means to be an ethical, open, and inclusive publisher. And again, those people will often have high level access. Certainly in the companies I worked at, that's often been the case. Anybody working in corporate responsibility by definition has the keys to the expensive offices. And finally, customer services and social media and anybody else public facing. Really useful to have along, or at least to talk to as you're building up this case. they will need resources too. Remember, they are the frontline receivers of accessibility queries most of the time. Whatever else you put in there, it will come down to whoever faces the public will receive accessibility queries. This is crucial because this is your first line of defense, but it's your first reception to these queries, so you can quickly act on them, do right by your print disabled readers, but also lower your risk, lower legal risk. I strongly suspect that when some legal trouble comes from the European Accessibility Act et al., it will be from a company that actually had a customer complain to them and just didn't notice or didn't hear or didn't act fast enough, rather than somebody just didn't even go to the publisher and went straight to the regulator. So really invest in that front line and make sure that a business case takes that into account. Those are the most important people to bring in to bolster that business case, but really think in the round about other people in your organization who have a stake in this, and make sure that they are involved in how you pitch this. Maybe pitch to them first and get their ideas. It should come as an organizational effort, not just as one person or one team pushing this up.
No, really, really good points there. And please do ask questions, because I'm sure there's lots of questions about what Simon has just said. There's so much detail there and so many things to think about. So once you've got all these people on board, I mean, Stacy, you've got experience of this. Once you've got all these people on board, you've got a lovely team and there's some sort of buzz going on about this. How do you make sure it's actually a priority across the business?
Thank you. So picking up on some of the wonderful points that Simon made, and making it an organization priority. There are several methods, as we know, adopted in publishing houses across the globe. But in my experience, particularly at Taylor and Francis, this is the model that works best, is the model, as Simon mentioned, it's having that wider responsibility across the organization. So in my view, accessibility should be part of a wide variety of staff remits spread across the business, and not sitting as an island with just one person or team responsible for pushing accessibility across the organization. This widespread approach allows the organization to have the shared knowledge, which is crucial, and the bandwidth to support and advance accessibility initiatives and create that effective business-wide strategy, rather than keeping accessibility siloed, often struggling to have a voice, knocking on a lot of closed doors. The business-wide approach will consequently make it easier to gain the buy-in needed from the business, as it's then possible to demonstrate the impact to both the business and the customer at a business-wide level. This should be the case, regardless of the size of the publisher. You can be a huge publisher and you could have a couple of hundred people involved in accessibility conversations and strategies, or you could be a publisher of 10 people and all 10 of you can be in those conversations about accessibility. It absolutely applies regardless of publisher house size. So thinking about these remits, these should include, as Simon mentioned, a wide variety of people from different departments, job roles, and seniority levels to ensure diverse and productive inputs. So colleagues from production, sales, editorial, marketing, and senior leadership, for example. Keeping it to just one person or team, again siloed, can inadvertently place too much pressure on that person or team, potentially setting them up to be that single point of failure rather than a success story, as they may face bottlenecks when trying to push an accessibility strategy, as they are not part of someone else's team. And so that importance of accessibility is not communicated, understood, or budgeted for, because it's never been discussed until now. To truly move accessibility, to use a colloquial term, it takes a village. You have one person trying to push a door open, probably going to be more effective with 10, more effective with 100. So the more people that are having those discussions, the better. Again, accessibility needs to be formalized in roles, strategy, and objectives, and not just done off the side of the desk. For accessibility to gain recognition and open those proverbial doors and gain recognition from senior leadership and ensure adequate budget acquisition and provision, the important word for me here is ownership. Ensuring the ownership and responsibility is formalized in objective strategy and process ensures a more robust approach and one that gets measured. In keeping with that proverb, what gets measured gets managed. So at Taylor and Francis, we started off by establishing a company-wide accessibility working group. So this group consisted of a key number of stakeholders. I think it's around minimum of 50 from all different departments. Pretty much every single department in Taylor and Francis has a representative at this working group. And this group helped and does help lobby the importance of accessibility, making noise and getting it on the senior leadership table. This led to the recognition and needed support being granted by the senior leadership team, with accessibility being placed on agendas across the business. An internal working group, it also provides a very useful platform for discussion, support, and cross-company collaboration. It helps ensure that you're not duplicating efforts. So if you're writing, for example, if book production have created a hub to tell people how to write alt text and support with that work, and then journals go off and write the same thing, marketing goes off and writes the same thing, it's not a great use of resources. And so again, bringing those partnerships together, bringing those departments together can help reduce the burden and the resources, and actually bring ideas together and create something that can be shared across the business and reduce workloads. Again, that group should be adequately widespread so that senior leaderships can't ignore the noise and are always aware of the importance and the goings on in terms of accessibility in your business. So at Taylor and Francis, our executive leadership team regularly join our accessibility working groups as active participants with a voice rather than as passive listeners or people looking at their watch. So this means that we are a heard voice for accessibility across the company, and we can strategically receive the buy-in that we need. And one final point on who should be involved. Again, we don't talk enough about end users. What if somebody who really needs, somebody like me, so somebody who understands what it's like to have and to not have accessible content, having somebody like that drive that agenda with that passion and lived experience can make a huge difference. So please always remember the end user experience and the value of it. Okay.
Yeah, that's a great point, Stacy. It's really getting real with it, isn't it? And getting all of those key stakeholders involved. So when it comes to prioritizing accessibility, though, within actual processes and actual projects rather within Taylor & Francis, for example, how to plan for that? How do you plan for that in the business case? How easy is that?
So you touch on one of my favorite phrases here. You can't unscramble an egg. So I talk a lot about this unscrambling the egg. And what that means is, if you build a process, a product, a platform, whatever it may be, and you don't include accessibility, at some point you're going to have to remediate. You're going to have to unscramble that egg, and that is a lengthy, costly, and a very messy process. So by establishing a culture where accessibility matters and is measured, as we talked about earlier, it means it becomes easier to ensure that accessibility is not an afterthought. Again, it becomes harder to ignore. Making sure that is embedded in strategy, objectives, and processes, and communicating to senior leadership and managers the compliance risk, as Simon mentioned, and the waste of resources when accessibility is left to the 11th hour. That's a very effective way of ensuring accessibility is considered from the beginning and throughout every project lifecycle. Essentially, no company likes to lose money. So putting a case forward demonstrating the business you will lose through not ensuring accessibility is a very effective way of drawing attention to the need to make everything born accessible and inclusive. If you put accessibility last, and by you I mean any colleague in that business, you are sending a message through the organization and up to the senior leadership team that accessibility is a low priority. So when legislation comes knocking and mandates that you need to take action, you will find getting that buy-in and budget very hard to find.
Yeah, so put it up front, get it in the business case straight up front. Really good. Excellent. So we all talk about DEI quite a lot. How does DEI connect with accessibility, Stacey, when creating a business case specifically?
So I love this topic because, as you said, Deborah, DEI does come up a lot, and thankfully a huge number of companies are taking positive steps towards their diversity, equality, and inclusion strategies. So by looking at your DEI objectives and strategies and considering how they align with the company's overarching strategy and mission, you actually can't achieve true diversity, equality, or inclusion without accessibility. You're not making people with different needs, disabilities, different reading requirements, whatever it may be, you're not including them if you're not including accessibility in that. So ensuring accessibility is a core element of your DEI strategy is another really good way of pushing the importance of accessibility up that flagpole and getting it noticed at the senior leadership level, allowing you to get the buy-in, the support, and the recognition that you need.
Yeah, fantastic. Great. Simon, I'm going to come back to you now. So we've got a wonderful strategy. I'm a publisher. I've got a wonderful strategy. How can we make sure the strategy actually sticks?
Yeah, this is another one of my hobby horses, because when you are planning for a business case and planning how you're going to tackle accessibility, it does sometimes get seen as a transformation, which it is, but almost as if that is a singular process. And it's not. It's an ongoing process. It's sort of two different tasks. The transformation is one piece, and then how you keep that up is another. And keeping it up is vital in terms of compliance, lowering legal risk. So when you're building a business case, part of that is making sure that you're talking about ongoing resources, not one-time resources. You're talking about how can we make sure that our workflow consistently outputs compliant files. Of course, lots of things vary per book. So the scope for automation and templating is not infinite. There will be things that will need to be looked at for every single book. But of course, in general, quality often does slip over time. A sampling system is pretty common, and that can work, but only if you've built a workflow around stage gates where certain things have to be there for a book, for a project, for any kind of publication to proceed through the production chain. So making sure that you've put the right gates in the right places and that everybody has the kind of instructions that they need is crucially important. Really, I prefer to think about it as accessible workflows rather than concentrating on the files themselves. And this is why auditing is only a part of the puzzle. It's not the whole thing. Making sure that the process that you have can only produce accessible files is how you lower legal risk. But because of that, that needs to be part of the business case.
Yeah, wonderful. Stacey, coming back to you with your T&F hat on and me with my supplier's hat on, when there are third parties involved, how does that affect the whole production chain and the business case that the publisher is trying to produce?
So this is a really interesting one, and it can be one that, if I'm being honest, can be quite unwieldy. And it's where we come back to this accessibility working group that's widespread across the organization. If you can imagine, you're a publisher of, say, 4,000 people, you've got a team of 10 responsible for accessibility, but they're siloed in a team. How on earth are you supposed to have 4,000 conversations and get that message across that actually when you're working with a third party, accessibility needs to be an integral part of those conversations? So ensuring third parties are dedicated and proactively working on accessibility is so crucial if you want to avoid that scrambled egg scenario that I mentioned earlier. Do you want the third party to provide or build you something only to find that it doesn't meet any compliance standards? It's not fit for purpose in terms of your customers and their needs, accessibility wise, and then actually you have to ask them to start all over again. It doesn't sound logical to me. So, you know, if we look at you know, your reputation as well, and you look at your company's dedication, you know, mission and objective strategy towards accessibility, but you bring on a third party who completely disregards that or doesn't engage with that, or you don't engage with them, again, you know, you're putting a lot of risk there. You're putting the risk on not supplying content or accessible platform to your customers, not bringing in that business, and then also, again, as we've mentioned, the reputational damage. So how do we ensure that third parties get on board and stay on board the accessibility ship? So accessibility should always be one of the key factors considered when choosing a third-party partner. Ensuring all those internal stakeholders we talked about are aware of the importance and how it interacts with their specific area. And again, having a working group where you can have these broader conversations allows that to flow a lot more easily and naturally. At a company, putting accessibility in front, bringing it up at the beginning of discussions and negotiations with third parties, and asking for accessibility policies and guidelines is crucial. Asking what standards do you follow and how do you comply with key legislation such as the EAA. You'll soon know if they're bluffing, if they have no idea what you're talking about. Now, some may say, do you know what, we don't work on that, but we want to. And it's always worth being open to those conversations as well. You can research their company as well to gauge their company approach and dedication to accessibility. Check out their accessibility statements and any work or output that they've done around that. Once you're happy with your third party and that their mission on accessibility and strategy aligns with that of your company, then make it legal. Put your accessibility expectations in a contract, because this ensures that both the third party and your company have a clear and binding understanding as to what is required in terms of accessibility. Going forward, make sure accessibility is visible. So that means that you should always be able to view and discuss accessibility progress in any project, no matter what you're working on, through project planning meetings and demonstrations. A nod of the head from a third party, I would say, is absolutely not enough. Speaking about accessibility at the end, as I've said before, not enough. Then you're going to be unscrambling that egg again. Only by making accessibility an integral part of any and all discussions and agreements can you secure and impart your company's dedication and ensure the importance of accessibility is mirrored by your third-party partner. And it ensures that you don't end up in hot water trying to unscramble a million eggs.
Yeah, brilliant advice. Make it all sound so easy, both of you. And I think it's been a wonderful insight. And again, we've only got one question in the Q&A box, so I'm sure there must be many, many more in people's minds. But I think Stacy gave me a nice segue, actually, to sort of introduce Lumina and how we work with our clients. So I am going to share a couple of screens. I hope you don't mind. But I wanted to just, in this discussion about getting your business on board, we do feel it's so important to be involved in that publishers right up front. So the way we sort of approach it, the way I've approached it in meetings with publishers, is to really come in on the consultancy level, really understand where their business is, where their current position is, what are their hopes and their fears with accessibility. Most of the time, their fears. So we really start off with that consultancy, and we test their content. We can test EPUBs, we can test PDFs, we can test their platforms and their sites and their multimedia content as well, and really help them and guide them on what needs to be done. And then, of course, a detailed proposal to support the business case that the publisher is trying to put to the senior management. Yeah, we want to be part of that business case. We want to be helping you create that, not only with pricing, but also with guidance on what needs to be done and potentially where that can put you as well. Simon and Stacy both talked about reputation and more sales. Yeah, but Simon was exactly right to say nothing can be guaranteed. But yeah, we'll help you along your way with that, and any other good vendor should as well. So then, of course, together we'll engage a project team, and that's a project team at Lumina and a project team at the publishers. So we'll work together, and I know we have many meetings, depending on the project, many meetings with our clients, our publisher clients, to make sure everyone is on the right path. And there you go. Look, Lumina will turbocharge, if you like, your program to comply, which I think is the important thing. We're not guaranteeing new business. We are saying you will reach a wider audience, but that giant leap across, get this in action and get it in progress and get it done. So that's the way we approach helping publishers get the whole of their business on board. So, of course, we have accessibility services. We do everything. We've been involved in accessibility since it's needed to be involved for 20-something years. We run accessibility audits. We create born accessible content. We work with PDF, Word, Excel, and PowerPoint to remediate content. We write image descriptions and alt text for images. We also work on transcripts, and we're working on Simon's transcripts for his podcast, which I would absolutely recommend any of you listen to those. And of course, subtitles, closed captions comes with all of that. So we do everything that's needed to help publishers become compliant with accessibility and do the right thing. We're a Benitech approved supplier as well for EPUBs, and we're really happy to be involved in the Publishing Accessibility Action Group, another group I really would urge you all to join if you're not members of that. Fantastic group, great resources, great people in there, really good. And they have several webinars as well running all the time, very active. So I would urge you all to become members of that if you're not already. So question time. So I'm going to get rid of these deck off the screen there, stop sharing, so I can see that there's still only one question in the question box, but there's two. Brilliant. Keep them coming.
Keep them coming.
Let's tackle the first one there. This is one directed at you, Simon. I would like to hear more about the accessibility statement books should refer to. There you go.
Yeah, so I'm not going to go too far into this now because, again, we're talking about business case, but yeah, this is a bit to not overlook. So the accessibility statement that your organization has on its website is crucially important. If you look up at the Aspire project, or Aspire, I think it's not a project anymore, that's from Textbox Digital, and that is an incredibly useful resource for building the accessibility statement and for having it audited if you wish to. They are the experts in that. I have no stake in that. I just think it's fantastic. But there is no exact formula for what goes in an accessibility statement, but there are plenty of do's and don'ts. Making sure that goes to the correct team within an organization is important. The team responsible for posting it may not actually be the team who should be writing it. Again, that's one of those things where something can get farmed out to IT that's really not for them. They're meant to post it. But I would say once you have a good accessibility statement, see Aspire, etc., it needs to be not just on one page of the website, but I always say put a link in the footer on every page to make sure it's easily visible. It's also something that can be referenced in your accessibility metadata, where you can put links to it in your summary, depending on which bit of metadata we're talking about.
Excellent. Fantastic. And another one here. Will digital products that exist before, exist before the EAA becomes law be required to be compliant next year? Or is there a grace period?
Oh, there's the
Oh,
question.
another.
That's a big question. So I think Simon and I would both preface this by saying we are not legal experts and we recommend
Yeah.
you sort your own legal advice.
This is a hot
But
debate.
it's a hot debate. But I guess the short answer, ebooks, front-end material, yes. Backlist, you can apply for disproportionate burden based on a set number of criteria. But essentially, again, yes, that is the aim of the European Accessibility Act.
Yeah, anytime this question comes up, you will find differing opinions. And this grace period thing is often said. Now, I don't want to give any opinion here that you will all go and use as your legal opinion. Talk to your lawyers. Fundamentally, one of the things that I mentioned earlier was your lawyers should be part of your business case. They are the ones who have to sign off on all of these decisions. You can give recommendations, you can say what you think, but the person who will have to give that recommendation officially and take responsibility for it needs to be a lawyer. So when it comes to the backlist question, this 5-year exemption thing, I am of the school of thought that Bill Kasdorf has talked about, that a few people have talked about, that it really sounds like that's applying to embedded software in embedded hardware. It really doesn't sound like it's for the books themselves. I'm highly suspect of that argument. In any case, it's probably not that important, and that sounds strange, but if you are talking about remediating your backlist, whether you've got 5 years or whether you need to do it tomorrow, either way, you've got to get started, which is a process of prioritizing it in terms of risk, demand, what have you. That needs to happen either way. So what are we talking about? How much you rush it, whether it's instant or 5 years? That's all we're talking about. It's not whether you do it. And remember that the longer you take, the more risk is there. Again, if this 5-year grace period is not applied, which in my opinion it won't be, if this comes to case law, then you're going to have a problem. So I think it's probably the wrong question to be asking, even though it sounds like the right one.
Yep, agreed.
Very nicely answered. Brilliant. So another one. So we've got some questions rolling in now. It's exciting. As someone who hasn't looked at the legislation yet, how future-proof is the EAA? Does it serve as an ideal baseline for compliance? Is that a tricky one again, isn't it?
It is a tricky one. So the European Accessibility Act it's an extension of the EU Accessibility Directive, and it's essentially that looked at the need for public digital services, etc., to be made accessible to people, particularly people using assistive technologies. The EAA is an extension of that then includes private companies, and so where Simon and I would look at it from, for example, is ebooks and e-commerce. So your book content has to be accessible, but also the method by which you pay for that digitally also has to be accessible as well. Now, I think we're going to see many iterations of the EAA, and this is opinion, not fact. So, for example, the current EAA legislation does not include journals, and that would seem to me to be incredibly remiss in making accessibility a priority and available to people. So, I think this is the start of a long journey that will build over time.
Yeah. And I think that's why it should come into the business case, should include content like journals that aren't in the compliance thing right now.
And what if it gets added later?
And it's going to come. Yeah, it's going to come.
The directive, it's a directive, it's not law. So national implementations can vary.
Absolutely.
So you're just waiting for an interpretation that includes, for instance, journals. And then you've got all of that remediation to do, which would have been a lot easier had you started earlier, looking for small exceptions, looking for ways around it. I know that's not small, but looking for ways to navigate through the wording is very, very risky. In terms of is the EAA is future-proof, I would say fundamentally, yes, actually it is, because it's vague. Because it's more of a statement of principle than a techniques document. Although, as I understand it, the European Commission are seeking to map it to specific technologies. There's some effort to that end. fundamentally, it will never prescribe exactly how to achieve this. It doesn't even say EPUB, it says ebook. So we're really not talking on a technical level here. It's talking about sort of functional accessibility. And that's not as likely to change. So I'd say investments in, if we're in the frame of business case again, investments in accessibility are not contingent on sort of possible future change in this legislation, except in terms of it maybe tightening.
Yeah, very good. We've got 3 more, I think. So besides image alt text, what are the biggest specific accessibility features that need to be added to ebooks? This is a practical question.
Wow. And we're back to
Yeah.
the how to do accessibility, which we said this webinar would not be because we've done this topic. But what do you think, Stacey?
Well, we could shoot bullet points, right? So what are some of the key things that we talk about a lot? So STEM content, making sure that STEM content, looking at, math, ML, these kind of things, that is accessible. That's a different area in itself. Music accessibility, for example, a different area in itself. And I think these are key aspects that need to be considered in addition to that big one, which is image descriptions.
Yeah. And then semantic code in the broad. So we're talking about EPUB type, we're talking about ARIA roles, we're talking about well-structured HTML, everything to make sure that you're not just a river of words and images, but in fact, a well-structured document that describes its own parts. One of the great benefits of making accessible files is you're making something more machine readable. In a way, that's all we mean by accessible, because we're trying to optimize how our books can be interoperated with, including by assistive technology. So we're trying to help machines read, right? Machine readable. And that has benefits beyond accessibility, in case you ever wanted to build some cool future tech, like having an AI answer questions about the content of a textbook or something. The more semantic richness that you can put into a book in the broad, the more extensible that becomes, more it's able to be transformed and engaged with by different technologies. So we won't go through all of the different code stuff to be done, but I'd say broadly speaking, semantic code, accessibility metadata, and image description are going to be kind of the big things.
And of course, this gives me an opportunity to say, Brenton, who's asked this question, please ask a vendor. Please come to me and we'll test your content. We'll tell you what's missing and what needs to be done. So there's no charge for that. So you just come to us and we'll help you, guide you, and tell you what work needs to be done, and we can do it for you. Okay, so I hope that answers that question. Brilliant. How does a service provider ensure the digital services and products meet EAA standards?
Is this a question about certification? Is that the gist?
Probably is, isn't it? How does a service provider ensure the digital service and products meet? Well, yeah.
Because you're talking about validating the result, right? Making sure, have we done enough? So we're talking about auditing.
Have we done enough? Does it work? Does it work through a screen reader? Are the image descriptions correct and comply with? Well, from a vendor's point of view, we understand all the compliancy rules back and forth and all over the place. They're in our blood. So we make sure that anything we produce, we test it before we output it to our publisher clients, and we make sure that it's working. So yeah, in the case of Lumina, everything will meet the standards.
Stacy?
Yeah, I think it's helpful to break it down a little bit. So rather than saying, if we do an audit, how do we test for compliance with the EAA? That's you want to go a layer below, in my view. You want to be looking at the web content accessibility guidelines. Does our platform conform with WCAG guidelines set by the World Wide Web Consortium? Or does our EPUB meet the accessibility standards set as well by the W3C? I would look to these, because actually these are the foundations on which the EAA is it's built on. It's compliance with these international standards. And I think there's a second question to that. There's actually a second part to that, which is who's doing your testing, right? So are you using software software can be really, really helpful, but it can also get things wrong, or it can highlight to you, oh, there's 202 errors on that page, and you think, oh my gosh, we can't deal with that. But actually, some of those errors, if if you sort a couple of them, it replicates, especially if you build with templates. And again, that's a whole other area to get into, but it becomes much easier to fix a problem across thousands of websites if you build through templates. But I think the other thing is, looking at, who does it need to work for? So not just legislation, but looking at setting up personas. Who are you making it work for? Magnification users, screen reader users, people with dyslexia, ADHD, autism, dyspraxia. There's a whole host of customer need out there. So making sure that you're aware of what your customer need is. And then the final point is, who can you actually get people who use those technologies, who use your content to be the testers, because they're going to be able to tell you, this works for me, this is accessible, or it's not. And ultimately, that's what the European Accessibility Act is aiming for.
Yeah, I mean, that's user experience, right? And that UX is not just for print. It's so important to think of this. What is the experience of using this? There are firms that specialize in auditing, but I would always, first question to them is always, do you have real users of this assistive technology working for you? Because Stacy mentioned this to me before, people often think they're testing it, but they're cheating. They'll peek at something. And it's not sufficient. Someone who actually uses this as how they navigate information needs to be testing it. There are automated tools, and Daisy has the ACE checker and the SMART tool, which are fantastic, and they are part of a validation process. But they would be the first to tell you that that's not the whole of it. Technical accessibility is not the whole story. There are actually lots of ways to make files technically accessible that might be a horrible user experience. The most basic version of that would be over tagging, which can make something a nightmare to move through, or redundant image descriptions. There are all kinds of things that can be kind of crappy user experience. Ultimately, auditing files, usually through sampling, right, is important. You need to know what you're putting out. But as I mentioned earlier, your process is the most important thing. So you'll notice with certification, a lot of firms are going for certified workflows or certified processes. It's not really practical to certify every individual publication as accessible unless you're producing a tiny number of documents per year or something. A certified workflow for accessibility should only be able to produce accessible results. It shouldn't even, it should be a given if you've got the right workflow in place. I know that that's saying a lot, but that's the way to look at it, rather than, I get a lot of clients whose first thought is auditing their content. And whilst I agree that we must look at the content, it's really looking only at the end of the process and not how that was arrived at. So I think this is an important piece about validating what you've made, but remember, it's only the end.
Yeah, agreed. And again, it goes back to the building accessibility and at the beginning of all of those processes, rather than developing something, building something, changing something, and then going, oh, we better check if it's accessible. Don't scramble the egg.
When I'm trying to assess how ready a client is for this stuff, that's the first thing I do, is sort of unpacking their whole, where accessibility sits in their culture and in all of their different processes and how we're getting to that point. As Stacy says, I love the unscrambling and everything. It's what we call the episode of the podcast that Stacy kindly appeared on. She's so full of this type of wisdom. Making a bunch of these files now while you're umming and ahhing and then coming back to them later, that's more unscrambling you've got to do, aside from your backlist that was already there. So acting pretty quickly, once again.
And more cost, isn't it, as well, for a publisher, if you have to go back and unscramble those eggs, more cost and
however
time
expensive
and everything.
it is to make them, it's more expensive to make the book in the first place and then go back and remediate for accessibility later.
Absolutely. And in terms of some platforms that, you may find you can't go back. You can't go back and fix it because it's been built, and to do that would cost so much money, so much time, and then you've left yourself open to a lot of risk, both in terms of losing customers, losing business, but also compliancy risk as well.
There's one more point I'd like to put on this question, which is for some publishers, and I'm thinking of often in education, if you also own the sole platform by which your content is consumed, then remember that the file itself being fully accessible does not mean that the end user's experience is. If you are just supplying to retailers, then that is your responsibility, and then the retailers have to make sure that their platform works. But if you own the platform, then you will need to make sure the platform's accessible too. I've certainly seen systems where accessible EPUBs are produced, or EPUBs with varying level of accessibilities, but then they go in a platform that covers all of that up, and screen reader software can't actually get to any of it. So that, again, you're thinking about the end point of this and how what the user experience was like.
Yeah, great points. 2 more. I can answer this next one, I think, and you two can probably nod. Is journal content included in the EAA?
No.
No.
Or I would say not yet.
Not yet. No.
All of these questions
So
about what is and isn't included are because the wording is vague. So we put that asterisk by everything.
But it's the right thing to do, isn't it? Yeah, like you say, Stacy. I mean, it's just a bit of a bad thing that journal content is not.
Well, I understand that it's not, because I think, you eat an elephant one bite at a time, right? And if they'd said you need to make everything accessible, your books, your ancillaries, your web content, your journals, I think it would have been too much for anyone to actually tackle. And so I do understand the segmented approach, even if it means we have to wait longer to get a final accessible result.
Yeah.
So also at least some journal production is already XML first, depending on the publisher. So sometimes it's actually easier to do accessibility work in those to transform those type of workflows than it is for ones that were primarily thinking about print. So in some ways, if you're in journals and you want to get on it, you might actually have an easier time than some of the very printy publishers. Yeah.
And I know journal publishers really do want to make sure their content is accessible. It's not that everyone's avoid. It's, I think I've had some great discussions with journal publishers actually on this. It's really good.
Yeah, and open access.
Final question.
Equal access to science, is so important. Yes. Talking about journals. Also, just on an ethical level, that is a hell of a thing to think about excluding anybody from. Talking about the progress of knowledge.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No. Final question. Many public sector websites remain inaccessible despite a European directive requiring them to be accessible. Does this set a bad precedent for the EAA?
Yes.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Yep. Been public sector regulation for a long time. So there's going to be a lot of non-compliance.
Yeah, that's a shaky seat to be sitting in, I think, if anyone's doing that. Fantastic.
It's a short
Brilliant.
answer. Yes.
Yeah, it's an easy one. Well, thank you. We've still got people on, so thank you so much. We've had people from all over the world join us today, so I'm really, really grateful, and so totally grateful to Stacy and Simon for spending the time with me today and with all of you. So I hope you've found it useful. We have recorded this. We will be sending you an email shortly with the recording. Please do send me any questions. If you have any more questions, please do. I can share probably finally my details on here. There you go. So there's my email. Do just fire away, ask us anything. We will be having another webinar. We're not sure on the topic yet, but we will be doing another one soon and we'll let you know. So brilliant. Thank you very much and have a great evening wherever you are or rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Very much.